He had been Santa Claus for 14 years, not the department store kind, the kind that sat in a plywood chair with a hired photographer and a queue of restless children and a 20-minute break at noon. He had done that once in the first year and had decided it was not the thing he wanted to do with the role. He wanted children to believe him. The department store version was theater. He wanted the real version, the version that required being known in the community you served, that required knowing the names, that required showing up at the library reading event and the elementary school program and the Christmas parade, and doing the same things in the same way, year after year, until the children who came to him as nervous 4-year-olds grew into the 10-year-olds who no longer needed him, and the next wave of 4-year-olds arrived. His name was Walter Joseph Hicks. He was 68 years old. He was a retired postal worker, 31 years, on a route in Clearwater, Florida, before he and his wife, Geneva, moved to Millbrook after Geneva's mother became unable to live alone and needed family within 20 minutes rather than 8 hours. He had retired rather than transfer because 31 years on the same route produced a relationship with that route and the people on it that did not transfer. He had said to his route supervisor when he put in the paperwork, "Some things don't move." The supervisor had said, "I know." He had said, "I'll miss you, Walter." Walter had said, "I'll miss the route." He had meant both things. He had taken the Santa role the first December after the move. Geneva had encouraged it. She had said, "You need something to do in December." He had said, "I have plenty to do in December." She had said, "You need something that feels like December." He had said, "I take your meaning." He had taken the meaning and the role. He had bought the suit that first year. Not a cheap one. A good one because a good suit communicated something to children that a cheap one did not, and had modified it over the years as the measurements shifted slightly in one direction or another, and had it professionally cleaned and pressed each November. He had the suit. He had 14 Decembers. He had the names. He kept a list, not a joke list. He kept the actual names of the children in the community who had visited him at the parade, or the library event, or the school program over the years, organized by year of first visit and by what they had asked for, because the thing that made children believe was that he remembered, and remembering required writing it down. The list was in a spiral notebook that had 43 pages used and that he reviewed every November. He could not keep all the names in memory across 12 months. The notebook kept them for him. He had started it in year 2, after the first year taught him that the specific magic of being remembered, being called by name, being asked about the thing you had mentioned the year before, was something children carried into the year with them. He had seen it in their faces when they realized he knew their name. It was a particular expression, the combination of delight and disorientation that came from encountering something that exceeded expectation. He had been working toward that expression for 13 years. He had also learned in 14 years what the children who did not know him yet looked like when they first saw him. There were children who came with full belief who had been told Santa was coming, and who arrived at the parade or the library event or the school program with the specific forward-leaning anticipation of someone who is expecting to see something they have been anticipating for weeks, and who looked at him and were immediately in the world the anticipation had prepared them for. There were children who came with half-belief, who were old enough to have heard the alternative explanations, but who were not yet old enough to fully commit to them, who looked at him with the careful expression of someone who is leaving room for the outcome they prefer, and who, when he called them by name, made their decision quickly and decisively in favor of belief. And there were children who came with no prior preparation, who had not been told in any particular way, and who encountered Santa Claus in the specific form of Walter Hicks for the first time without any framework for what they were seeing, and who had to build their understanding from scratch in the moment. He preferred the third kind. He had always preferred the third kind. They were the children who showed him what was actually happening when a child encountered the genuine version of a thing, not the scaffolded version, not the version that had been anticipated and explained, but the thing itself in its complete form. They showed him in their 3 seconds of encounter what the thing was capable of producing when it was done right. He had thought about this a great deal over 14 years. He had thought about what it meant to do Santa Claus right, not in the way of the institution, which was to provide the costume and the chair and the photographer and the cue, but in the way of the thing itself, which was to embody something that children needed and that the community needed, and that the doing of it correctly year after year produced in both. He had come to the conclusion that what he was doing was not performance, but service. The children needed to believe in something generous and paying attention and knowing their names. He was the thing that offered them that. The offering required that he show up every year and know the names and call them out on the parade route and be the same thing every time, so that the children who had seen him before could rely on the continuity, and the children who were seeing him for the first time could step into a world that was already established and ready for them. He was the only black Santa Claus most of the children in Millbrook had ever seen. He had understood this from the first year. He had decided in the first year that he was going to be exactly as Santa could be, not in reaction to being the only black one, but because being exactly as Santa could be was what the role required and what the children needed, and what he was going to give them regardless of whether they had seen it before in this particular configuration. In 14 years, he had never seen a child hesitate at his blackness. He had seen children hesitate at his size. He was a large man, and large strangers could be alarming to small children, and he had learned to be slower and lower when a small child was uncertain, crouching to their level and saying their name in a lower register, so that his size was not the first thing they registered. But no child had ever looked at him and rejected the premise. The children had believed him because he had given them something worth believing in, and what he looked like was part of what he gave them. He understood this and had never needed to explain it to himself. Geneva said he took it too seriously. She said this every November while helping him press the suit. He had said, "I'd take it exactly as seriously as it deserves." She had said, "That is what I said." They had been married for 42 years. They understood each other. Geneva said he took it too seriously. She said this every November while helping him press the suit. He had said, "I take it exactly as seriously as it deserves." She had said, "That is what I said." They had been married for 42 years. They understood each other. He had a son named Charles who was 40 and who lived in Tampa, and who came to Millbrook every Christmas, and who had been old enough when Walter started the Santa role to be amused rather than enchanted, which was a different and less interesting condition. Charles had said, "The first Christmas, are you actually going to be Santa?" Walter had said yes. Charles had said for real, or like the mall kind. Walter had said for real. Charles had said people aren't going to know what to do with that. Walter had said the children will know what to do with it. He had been right. The children knew exactly what to do with it, which was believe. Charles had come to understand the role differently in the years since. He had come to Millbrook for Christmas every year and had gone to the parade every year, not because he had any particular investment in the parade, but because his father was in the parade, and going to the parade was the thing you did. He had watched his father work the street from the sleigh, and had watched the crowd's faces the way Earl's wife had watched them, and had come to the same conclusion Earl's wife had come to, which was this is different from what the first two were doing. He had said to Geneva in the 8th year, "Does he actually know all those names?" She had said, "He has a notebook." Charles had said a notebook. She had said since year 2. He had said, "How many names are in it?" She had said, "I have not counted." He had said he knows them in the moment. Geneva had said yes. He had said, "Does he study it?" She had said, "He reviews it every November." He had said the whole notebook. She had said, "Every November." He had said, "Mom." She had said yes. He had said, "That is the most dad thing I have ever heard." She had laughed. He had said, "Does it work?" She had looked at him. She had said, "You watched the parade." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "What do you think?" He had thought. He had said, "Yes." He had said, "It works." He had also in the past year been glad his father had not been removed. He had not known about the threat until Geneva called him, and Geneva had called him when the review was resolved and it was confirmed, and he had listened and had said someone tried to remove him. Geneva had said yes. He had said, and the councilwoman read the complaints together. She had said yes. He had said, and the town manager confirmed him. Geneva had said yes. Charles had been quiet for a moment. He had said good. Geneva had said yes. He had said 14 years. Geneva had said yes. He had said, and next year 15. Geneva had said yes. He had said, "Tell Dad." Geneva had said, "I will." She had told him. Walter had said yes. He had said 15 next year. He had written it in the notebook. At the bottom of the last page of the prior year's entries in the block printing year 15, next December. He had closed the notebook. He had gone to make coffee. The Millbrook Christmas Parade had been running for 22 years. It went down Main Street from the fire station to the town square, which was a route of 8 blocks, and it featured the high school band and the elementary school choir, and the youth soccer league and the VFW color guard, and the float built by the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce, and at the end, Santa Claus in a horse-drawn sleigh. The sleigh had been the contribution of Earl Fontaine, who kept horses on his property 12 miles east of town, and who had built the sleigh himself over a winter in his barn, and who had been pulling Santa on it for the past 11 years. Earl was 73, and his horses were named Biscuit and Cobbler. He was the kind of man who named horses after food. Walter had asked him about it once. Earl had said, "I spend a lot of time with them." He had said, "I think about what I appreciate most." Walter had said, "And you appreciate food." Earl had said, "I appreciate Biscuit and Cobbler specifically." They had understood each other. Earl had come to the Santa role before Walter did, in a manner of speaking. He had provided the sleigh for the parade for 11 years, which meant he had worked with 3 Santas before Walter. The first 2 had been fine, he said. The third had been Walter, and Walter had been different. Earl had said to his wife, "The third one knows what he's doing." She had said, "What do you mean?" He had said the first 2 sat in the seat and waved. He had said, "Walter works the street." She had said, "What does that mean?" He had said he knows names. He had said he calls them out. He had said the other 2 were riding in the sleigh. Walter is doing the parade. She had said, "Is that so different?" He had said, "You watch the crowd's face with the first 2 and the third one, and you tell me." She had watched. She had told him. He had been right. Earl had been retired from farming for 6 years. Not from the horses, which were a different thing from farming. Which were the thing he kept, because the horses were the thing he could not let go of. And he spent his mornings on the property and his afternoons doing the maintenance work that a 12-acre property and 2 horses required, and he drove to the parade every first Saturday in December in the truck with the trailer and Biscuit and Cobbler and the sleigh, and he and Walter had 11 years of this. And it was one of the things of his year that he valued in a way he had not been able to articulate until Walter had been threatened with removal, at which point he had been able to articulate it immediately. "This is the thing I am not going to let happen." He had called the town manager before breakfast. His wife had heard him on the phone and had come to the kitchen and had stood in the doorway listening and had said nothing until he hung up and then had said, "Good." He had said, "Yes." She had said 11 years. He had said yes. She had said Biscuit would miss him. He had said Biscuit would be inconsolable. They had both said nothing for a moment, and then Earl had gone to check on Biscuit, who was in fact fine and who acknowledged him the same way she always did, which was to look at him with the specific attention of a horse who knows the person and has assessed the situation and has decided everything is proceeding normally. The trouble with the parade started 5 months before the parade. A man named Brian Kowalski had moved to Millbrook 18 months ago. He was 38. He had worked in event management in other cities before Millbrook, and had come to Millbrook to take a position as the town's community events director, which was a newly created position in the town manager's office that was responsible for coordinating the public events that the town ran or co-sponsored. He had taken the position because Millbrook had a growing events calendar and needed someone to coordinate it, and because the salary was better than his previous position, and the town was a reasonable place to live. He had a view about what the town's public events should look like. The view was based on his experience in event management in larger cities where the events were professionally produced and the talent was vetted, and the visual consistency of the event was managed against a style guide. He had tried to import this view into Millbrook, which had its own culture of events that had been built over 2 decades, and that did not need a style guide because it was held together by something else, which was continuity and recognition, and the specific social trust that comes from the same people doing the same things in the same way every year. He had not grown up in Millbrook and did not understand what the Christmas parade meant to the people who had been attending it for a decade or 2 decades, or for the full 22 years it had been running. He understood it as an event, a production with elements and logistics and visual presentation, but not as a thing that had been built incrementally from the community's own investment, and that was held together by the people who had built it. This was the distinction he had missed, and the distinction mattered, because events that are held together by professional production can be improved by improving the production, while events that are held together by community investment require a different kind of attention, which is the attention to what is already working and why. He had not asked why the Christmas parade worked. He had reviewed the elements and formed views about their quality, which was the wrong question. The right question would have been, what is it about this parade that has made 800 people come to Main Street in the cold on the first Saturday of December for 22 years? And what in this parade is doing that? And how do I avoid disturbing it? He had not asked this question. He had asked instead what could be improved, and he had begun improving things, and the thing he had identified as improvable was Santa Claus, and he had been wrong about that specifically. He had begun coordinating the Christmas parade 5 months out. He had reviewed the existing parade elements and had formed views about them. He had met with the high school band director and the elementary school choir teacher and the Chamber of Commerce float committee. He had met with Earl Fontaine and asked about the horse's noise level. Earl had said Biscuit is a talker. Cobbler is quiet. Brian had said, what does that mean for the parade? Earl had said it means you'll hear Biscuit. Brian had made a note. He had not met with Walter Hicks. He had seen Walter's name in the parade coordination file and had seen that Walter had been the parade's Santa for 14 years and had formed a view about Walter on the basis of Walter's photograph in the file. The photograph from the previous year's parade, Walter in the full red suit and the white beard, and the hat standing in the sleigh with his hand raised in the wave that he had perfected over 14 years, the wave that communicated both greeting and blessing in a single gesture. Brian had formed a view about this photograph that was not a view about the quality of Walter's performance in the role, but a view about whether Walter's appearance matched what he believed the role required. He had not examined this view. He had proceeded from it. He had sent an email to the address in the parade coordination file, which was the address Walter had provided when he registered as a parade participant 14 years ago, and which was still listed as the contact for the Santa float. The email said that the town was conducting a review of parade participants for the coming year, and that he would like to schedule a call to discuss Walter's participation. Walter had responded that he was available and had suggested 3 times. Brian had not responded to the suggested times. He had sent a second email 4 weeks later. This one said that the town was considering updates to the parade's visual presentation and that the Santa role would be subject to a review process. He asked Walter to provide a photograph of his costume and his past experience in the role. Walter had responded with both a photograph taken at the previous year's parade and a summary of his 14 years in the role. He had included the names of 3 families who could provide references and the name of Millbrook Elementary School's principal with whom he had worked every year for the library reading event. Brian had not acknowledged receipt. 3 months before the parade, he had sent a third email. This one said that the town was considering whether to open the Santa role to additional applicants and that Walter should be aware that his participation in the coming year's parade was not confirmed. He said the review process would conclude by the end of the month. Walter had called Geneva from the kitchen when he read the third email. He said they may not be using me this year. She had come to the kitchen. She had read the email. She had looked at Walter. She had said, "What do you want to do?" He had said, "I want to understand what is actually happening." She had said yes. He had said, "And I want to handle it correctly." Walter had spent a week considering what to do. He had told Geneva about the emails. Geneva had said, "What is your read on this?" He had said, "I think someone new is trying to make changes that he has not thought through." She had said, "And you think the change he is trying to make is you?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Are you sure?" He had said, "I am as sure as I can be from 3 emails." She had said, "What would make you more sure?" He had said, "Reading the complaint file." She had said, "Do you have access to the complaint file?" He had said no. She had said, "Who does?" He had thought about this. He had said the town clerk's office. He had said, "And the councilwoman." Geneva had said Patricia Chen. He had said yes. She had said, "Call Patricia." He had said, "I will call the principal first." Geneva had said, "Why the principal first?" He had said, "Because Dr. Barnes has direct experience of the role I perform and direct knowledge of its effect, and her account will be specific." He had said, "Patricia Chen has the political access, but Dr. Barnes has the evidence." Geneva had said, "Call them in that order then." He had called them in that order. He called the Millbrook Elementary School principal, Dr. Shirley Barnes, who had known Walter for 11 years, and who had been watching what was happening with the email chain because her assistant had mentioned it. "Dr. Barnes," said Walter. He said, "Shirley." She said, "I heard about the review." He said, "Do you know what it's about?" She said, "I know what it looks like." He said, "I have been Santa in this town for 14 years. She said, "I know." She said, "I have watched the children at the library program and at the school program for 11 of those years." She said, "I want to help." He said, "I would appreciate a call to the town manager's office." She said, "I will call this afternoon." He also called Earl Fontaine. Earl said, "I already heard." He said, "I called the town manager myself this morning." He said, "I told them that if they are going to use a different Santa, I am going to need to think about whether I want to keep providing the sleigh." He said, "Because the sleigh is for Walter." Walter said, "Earl." Earl said, "I mean it." He said, "I have driven that sleigh for 11 years with you in it." He said, "I am not driving it for someone else." Walter said, "That is a generous thing to say." Earl said, "It is not a generous thing. It is a practical thing." He said, "I built that sleigh for this parade, and this parade has Walter in it." Walter said, "I don't want you to make a decision that you'll regret." Earl said, "I have been making decisions for 73 years. I don't regret the ones that are right." He also called Councilwoman Patricia Chen, who had represented Millbrook's 2nd District for 8 years, and who had attended the Christmas parade every year and who had been present at the last 6 library reading events. She said, "Walter, I am glad you called." He said, "I wanted to make sure the right people were aware of what is happening." She said, "I am aware." She said, "Tell me what you know." He told her. She listened. She said, "I want to look at the prior year's parade coordination process and see whether there are complaints on file." He said, "Complaints." She said, prior complaints. She said, if there have been complaints about the parade previously, I want to know whether they have been reviewed together or individually. He had not thought to ask this. He said, why does that matter? She said, because if this review is triggered by complaints, the nature of the complaints and how they have been handled tells us something about what the review is actually about. He said, all right. He said, who would I contact? She said, I will contact them. He thought after he hung up about what Patricia had said. He thought about why individual complaints and sequential complaints were different things, and he thought about this the way he thought about most things that he had not previously considered, carefully turning it over in his mind and examining it from different sides until he understood the structure of it. An individual complaint was a single data point. It described one person's experience or position. A sequential set of complaints from different people over time about the same thing was a different kind of data. It described not one person's experience, but a pattern of experience, and the pattern told you something. The individual complaint could not tell you, which was whether the thing was happening consistently and to whom and in what circumstances. He had understood this by the time he talked to Geneva that evening, and he had told her, and she had said, Patricia Chen is smart. He had said yes. He had said, she looked for the pattern first. Geneva had said, what do you think the pattern is going to show? He had said, I think it is going to show what we suspect. She had said, and if it does? He had said, then the town manager will have a decision to make that is not about my suit or my experience. She had said yes. She had said, and Gerald Abrams is a decent man. He had said, I believe he is. She had said, we will see. She contacted the town clerk's office and asked for the file of complaints related to the Christmas parade for the past 3 years. There were 4 complaints on file. The first, from 2 years ago, had been filed by a man named David Lowell, who had attended the parade and had written to the town manager's office to say that the parade's Santa was not the kind of Santa he expected, and that the town should consider the visual presentation more carefully. The second, from 18 months ago, had been filed by an anonymous sender who had written that the Santa did not look authentic, and that the town should update its approach. The third, from 8 months ago, had been filed by a woman named Carol Shute, who said the Santa made her children uncomfortable, and that the town should consider a change. The fourth was from Brian Kowalski's own review memo written 6 weeks ago, which said the Santa role needed modernization and suggested the position be opened to additional applicants. Patricia Chen read all 4 documents together. She read them in the order they were filed. She saw what she saw in 15 minutes. The first complaint from David Lowell 2 years ago had said the Santa does not look like the kind of Santa I expected, and I think the town should consider the visual presentation more carefully. The second, from an anonymous sender 18 months ago, had said the Santa does not look authentic, and the town should update its approach. The third, from Carol Shute 8 months ago, had said the Santa made my children uncomfortable, and the town should consider a change. The fourth, from Brian Kowalski's own review memo 6 weeks ago, had said the Santa role needs modernization, and the position should be opened to additional applicants. The word authentic appeared twice. The phrase visual presentation appeared twice. The phrase kind of Santa I expected appeared once. The phrase made my children uncomfortable appeared once without explanation of what had made the children uncomfortable. None of the complaints mentioned Walter's conduct or the quality of his performance. None of the complaints said anything about what the children in the crowd had experienced or expressed. None of the complaints cited anything about the role beyond its visual presentation. Patricia had attended 6 of the last 14 parades. She had been at the library reading events for 4 of the last 6 years. She had watched children encounter Walter Hicks. She had watched children hear their name called from the sleigh. She had watched the expression that followed the expression Walter had described to her as belief, and she had understood from watching it that the expression was not produced by the costume, but by the person inside it, and that the person inside it had spent 14 years, building the capacity to produce that expression in children who had never seen him before and in children who had been seeing him for years. She had known reading the 4 complaints exactly what they were about, because she had seen exactly what they were objecting to, and what they were objecting to was not the quality of the role's performance, but the identity of the person performing it. She called the town manager a man named Gerald Abrams, who had been the Millbrook town manager for 6 years. She said, "Gerald." He said, "Patricia." She said, "I have been reading the complaint file about the Christmas parade." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to read all 4 together in the order they were filed." He said, "I've read the individual reviews." She said, "Read them in sequence, Gerald." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "All right." He called her back in 20 minutes. He said, "I see it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "All 4 are about the same thing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "They are all about Walter being black?" She said, "Yes." She said, "No complaint says so explicitly." She said, "The complaints say does not look authentic. Not the kind of Santa I expected, made my children uncomfortable." She said, "Walter has been Santa in this town for 14 years and has had no substantive complaint about his performance of the role in 14 years, and all 4 complaints reference his appearance rather than his conduct." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the events director's review memo, which recommends opening the role to additional applicants, was written 6 weeks after the 3rd complaint, and does not reference the complaint, but addresses the same concern." He said, "Yes." He said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to confirm Walter's participation in this year's parade, and I want to review how the complaints were processed and why they were not flagged for pattern review when the second one arrived." He said, "All right." He said, "I will call Brian." There was a conversation between Patricia Chen and Gerald Abrams that neither of them had expected to need to have, which was the conversation about what the complaint file meant in terms of what had been happening in the town for 2 years. The complaints were on file. They had each been received and logged. No one had read them together because the process did not require it. Gerald had read the 3rd one, the Carol Shute complaint, 8 months before, and had forwarded it to the events coordinator's office with a note that said, "For awareness." He had not connected it to the first 2. He had not known to connect it to the first 2. He had read it as a single complaint from a single parent, and had filed it accordingly. This was not a failure of attention on his part. It was a failure of the process's design. The process had not required the connection. He had not made it. The design was what needed to change. He had said this to Patricia, and Patricia had said yes, and the design is going to change. And I want to make sure the new design requires sequential review from the 2nd complaint onward, not the 3rd. He had said yes. She had said, because in the gap between the 2nd and the 3rd, Walter Hicks spent 2 months receiving emails about a review of his 14-year role that was not warranted. He had said yes. She had said the gap cost him 2 months. He had said yes. She had said the new design will close the gap. He had said yes. He had said, "I will write the new procedure." She had said, "Good." She had said, "I will review it before it is implemented." Gerald Abrams called Brian Kowalski and said, "I have reviewed the complaint file and your review memo." He said, "I want to understand what the basis for the review was." Brian said the Santa role has not been updated in several years, and I thought it was appropriate to refresh. Gerald said, "Has there been a substantive complaint about the Santa's performance of the role?" Brian said there have been concerns expressed. Gerald said there have been 4 complaints about the Santa's appearance. He said none of them reference the conduct of the role. He said Walter Hicks has performed this role for 14 years, and there is no complaint about how he has performed it. He said the complaints are about how he looks. He said that is not a basis for a review. He said Walter's participation in this year's parade is confirmed. Brian said, "I think the town should have the option to reconsider." Gerald said the town's position is that Walter Hicks is the Millbrook Christmas Parade Santa. He said that is the town's position going into this year's parade, and it will remain the town's position. He said, I want you to send Walter a confirmation of his participation today. There was a question that Patricia Chen had raised with Gerald Abrams that he had answered carefully, and that both of them had noted for the record what was going to happen about Brian Kowalski. Gerald had said Brian made an error of judgment. He had said he pursued a review of a community role on the basis of complaints that were about the performer's identity rather than his performance, without examining the complaints carefully enough to understand what they were actually about. He had said, I want to have a direct conversation with him about what happened and why the review was inappropriate. He had said, I also want to ensure that the complaint review process for community events is updated so that appearance-based complaints are distinguished from performance-based complaints and flagged for additional review. He had said Brian is new, and he made a judgment error. He had said the error is correctable. Patricia had said all right. She had said, I want to be copied on the outcome. Gerald had said yes. Brian Kowalski had been in his role for 18 months. He had come to Millbrook to build something. He had understood after the conversation with Gerald that he had been doing the wrong thing, not because Gerald had said so harshly, but because Gerald had laid out what the complaints actually said and what they did not say, and had shown him the gap between what he had done and what the complaints warranted, and the gap was large and visible and his. He had sent the confirmation to Walter that afternoon, and had sat for a while at his desk afterward. He had been in event management for 12 years. He had run events in 4 cities. He had never considered himself the kind of person who would try to remove a black man from a community role on the basis of complaints about appearance. He had never considered it because he had never examined what he was doing while he was doing it. The examination he understood now was the step he had skipped. Brian sent the confirmation that afternoon. Walter received it. He read it. He called Geneva. He told her what had happened. He told her about Dr. Barnes's call and Earl's call and Patricia Chen's call. He told her about the complaint file and the 4 complaints. Geneva was quiet for a moment. She said, 4 complaints about what you look like. He said yes. She said, in 14 years. He said yes. She said, and none about what you do. He said none. Geneva was quiet again. She said, and Gerald Abrams confirmed you. He said yes. She said good. She said, is there anything else you need to do? He said, I am going to call Patricia Chen and thank her. She said, do that. He said, and I am going to call Dr. Barnes. She said yes. He said, and I am going to call Earl. She said, tell Earl. I said thank you. He said, I will. He said, and then I'm going to go over the list. Geneva said the notebook. He said yes. She said November already. He said yes. He said, I have new children this year. I need to know their names. He called Patricia Chen. He said, I want to thank you for reading the complaints together. She said they needed to be read together. She said individually they each looked like a single concern. Together they looked like a pattern. He said, yes. She said, Walter. He said, yes. She said, I want to tell you something. He said, all right. She said, I have been going to your reading event at the library for 7 years. She said, I have watched children come to you who have never seen a black Santa Claus before. She said, I have watched what happens on their faces. He said, yes. She said, I want you to know that I have been thinking about that expression for 7 years, and I have never figured out what to call it. He said, I know what to call it. She said, what? He said, belief. She was quiet for a moment. She said, yes. She said, that's the right word. She also told him what the complaint file had said. She told him all 4 documents in the order they were filed because she believed he was entitled to know what had been said and by whom and in what sequence. He listened. He was quiet for a longer moment than usual after she finished. He said the phrase does not look authentic. She said yes. He said 14 years. She said yes. He said, I have 14 years of parents who will tell you I looked very authentic. She said, I am one of them. He said, I know. He was quiet again. He said, Patricia. She said, yes. He said, the complaint from 8 months ago made my children uncomfortable. She said, yes. He said, did the complaint say what had made them uncomfortable? She said, no. He said, no. He said, not the noise of the crowd, not the cold, not the length of the route. She said, no. He said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, all right. He said, I am glad it is resolved. She said, yes. He said, I am going to do the parade. She said, yes. He said, and next year? She said, yes. He said, and the year after that? She said, yes. He said, thank you, Patricia. She said, thank you, Walter. She said, for 14 years of keeping the list. He had not mentioned the list to her before. He said, how did you know about the list? She said, Marcus Ellery told his mother. He said, Marcus has been coming to the parade for 7 years. She said, yes. He said, he told her I knew his name from the notebook. She said, yes. He said, Marcus is 11. He said he is not supposed to tell people how it works. She laughed. He laughed. She said he could not help it. She said it impressed him too much to keep. He said, yes. He said, I'll forgive him. She said, I think that's wise. He called Patricia Chen and thanked her. He called Dr. Barnes. He called Earl. Then he reviewed the notebook. The November review of the notebook was a ritual. He made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Not the desk, the kitchen table, because the notebook review was not work in the desk sense, but preparation in the kitchen sense. The kind of preparation that happened over coffee in the room where the day started, and he went through the pages in order. He read each name. He noted which children were in their last year before middle school and would not be coming back, and he noted which children were in the years where they would still come and what they had asked for or talked about the year before. He noted the children he had seen at the library event in the spring, and whether anything had changed in their circumstances that he was aware of a new sibling, a move, a change of school. He noted the children who were new this year, the ones he had seen for the first time in the spring and who would be coming to the parade for the first time in December. He wrote their names on a separate page at the back of the notebook, which was the new names page for the current year. There were 11 new names this year. He reviewed each one. He thought about the child behind each name, what he knew about them from the library event or the school program, what the child had told him or shown him or asked him, what he would be able to say to them at the parade that would produce the expression. He had gotten good at this. He had not been born good at it. He had become good at it over 14 years of doing it carefully and adjusting when the adjustment was called for. He had become good at it the way you become good at anything that requires both skill and attention by doing it with full attention and by learning from the doing. Geneva had come into the kitchen at some point during the November review and had looked at him at the table with the coffee and the notebook and had said nothing. She had poured her own coffee. She had sat across from him. She had read her book. He had finished the review and closed the notebook and looked up. She had looked up from the book. They had not said anything. They had drunk their coffee. This was also 14 years of practice. The parade was on the first Saturday of December. It was cold in the specific way of a clear December morning, which was not the oppressive cold of a storm, but the clean cold of a sky that had nothing in it and that made the colors of the parade sharp and distinct. Walter was in the suit at 10 in the morning in Earl's barn, where Earl was harnessing Biscuit and Cobbler and where the sleigh had been polished and the velvet cushion on the seat had been brushed. Earl said, "Good morning, Santa." Walter said, "Good morning, Earl." Earl said, "Biscuit is in good spirits." Walter said, "I'm glad." Earl said, "Cobbler is always in good spirits." Walter said, "I know." Earl finished the harness and looked at Walter. He said, 14 years. Walter said 14 years. Earl said, You ready? Walter said, I have been ready since November. Earl laughed. He said yes. He said, I know. The parade moved down Main Street in the order it always moved, the high school band first, then the color guard, then the youth soccer league in their jerseys, then the elementary school choir on a flatbed truck singing carols, then the Chamber of Commerce float, and then at the end Earl driving the sleigh and Walter in the seat with the bag and the bells and the wave. The crowd was 800 people across 8 blocks, which was not a large number in absolute terms, but was a large number relative to the population of Millbrook, and the crowd included the families who had been coming to this parade for a decade, and the families who had moved to Millbrook in the past year and who were coming for the first time, and the children who had seen Walter at the library event, and the children who had not seen him yet. He saw the children's faces as the sleigh moved down the street. He saw the faces he recognized from the notebook, the children who were old enough to know the exercise, but who watched the sleigh anyway with the fondness of knowing something from the inside. He saw the faces that were new, the 4-year-olds who were seeing this for the first time and who had not yet formed the particular kind of belief that was about to be offered to them. He saw Dr. Barnes at the 5th block. She had come every year for 11 years. He had called her name the first year, and she had laughed in surprise, not expecting to be on the list, not expecting to be recognized, and he had called it every year since. It was a different kind of call than the children's, less about belief and more about continuity, the call that said, I see you. I have been seeing you. You are part of this. He saw families he recognized from the library event and the school program. He saw the Ellery family, Marcus 11, who had been coming to the parade since he was 3, who was beyond the believing age but who stood next to his younger brother and watched his younger brother's face with the specific protective attention of an older sibling who is not going to interfere with his brother's moment. Walter called Marcus's name anyway. Marcus's expression was the expression of an 11-year-old who is pleased and does not want to show it. He saw a woman he did not recognize who was holding a child he did not know. The child was perhaps 4 in a green coat with a hood, and the child was watching the sleigh with the full-body attention of a child who is in the process of forming a belief and who is not going to look away. Walter found the child's eyes. He did not know the name. He would not call a name he did not have. He gave the child instead what he had developed over 14 years, as the substitute for the name, the direct look, the nod, the specific small gesture that said, I see you. You are included in this. You are here, and I know it. The child's expression shifted in a way that the mother noticed, and the mother looked at Walter, and Walter gave her the same nod. She put her hand on the child's shoulder. He called out names. He called them in the order they appeared on the street because that was how he worked. He did not have a prepared list of which names to say at which block. He called the ones he saw, and he had learned over 14 years that knowing the name when the child was standing right there was what produced the moment. He said, Marcus. He said, hello, Tiana. He said, Amara. I remember what you asked for last year. A small girl in a red coat lost her composure entirely and pressed her face into her mother's coat. Her mother looked at Walter with the expression of someone who was seeing something happen in real time that they were going to describe to other people for years. He gave her a small nod. She nodded back. Dr. Barnes was on the curb at the 5th block. She waved. He called her name. She put her hand over her heart. Patricia Chen was at the town square with Gerald Abrams. She watched the sleigh come down the last block. She watched the crowd follow the sleigh toward the square, not follow it in an organized way, but drift after it, the way crowds drift after something that is moving in the direction they want to go. She said to Gerald, look at that. He said, yes. She said, that is what 14 years looks like. He said, yes. She said from the outside. He said yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I'm sorry it came this close to not happening. She said it did not come close. She said it came to a few emails and a complaint file. She said, and then we read the complaints together. He said yes. She said that's the part that mattered. He said yes. He said it is. Earl pulled the sleigh into the town square and brought Biscuit and Cobbler to a stop at the designated point. Walter stood up in the sleigh and addressed the crowd, which was the tradition. Not a long address, not a speech, just the sentence that had been the same for 14 years. Merry Christmas, Millbrook. I will see you all again next year. There was a child near the front of the crowd who said very clearly in the specific, unmodulated voice of a 5-year-old, How does he know our names? Her mother laughed. The people around them laughed. Walter heard it from the sleigh and laughed. He said, I keep a list. The child said, a real list. He said, a very real list. She said, what is on it? He said, names. He said, a lot of names. He said, yours is going to be on it next year. He climbed down from the sleigh. Earl was already unharnessing Biscuit, who was indeed talking a low, pleased sound that horses make when they have done something they understand and are ready for their reward. Cobbler was quiet, as Cobbler always was. Walter put his hand on Biscuit's nose. Biscuit acknowledged him. Earl said that was a good one. Walter said they are all good ones. Earl said some are better than others. Walter said yes. He said this one was good. He said, thank you, Earl. Earl said 14 years. He said, and next year 15. Walter said yes. He said, and the year after that 16. Earl said yes. He said, I'll keep the sleigh. Walter said, I know you will. Geneva was waiting at the edge of the square. She had driven separately because she liked to watch from the crowd rather than from the sleigh. She had been watching from this parade for 14 years. She said, good parade. He said yes. She said, that little girl. He said yes. She said, how does he know our names? He laughed. She laughed. He said, I keep a list. She said, you have always kept a list. He said yes. He said it is the most important part. She said, I know. She put her arm in his. They walked toward the car. The square was still full of people, the crowd that had drifted after the sleigh now resting in the square with their cups of hot cider from the town's refreshment stand and their children and their December morning. Walter said the new names this year. She said yes. He said there were a lot. She said good. He said I'm going to write them in the notebook tonight. She said I know. She said I will make dinner. He said yes. He said, I will be at the table by 7. He had one more thing to do before he left the square. Dr. Barnes was talking to Patricia Chen near the refreshment stand, and he stopped to say goodbye to them both. Dr. Barnes said next year. He said next year, she said, and the year after that. He said yes. She said, Walter. He said yes. She said, I want you to know that I am going to write a letter to the town manager's office about the library reading event. She said I should have written it sooner. He said, you don't need to. She said no. She said, I want the record to include what happens at that event. She said because the record that the town manager read was a complaint file with 4 complaints about your appearance. She said, I want the record to also include what I have been watching for 11 years. He said, Shirley. She said, yes. He said, I appreciate it. She said, good. She said, I will write it tomorrow. He said, all right. He said, I will write the new names in the notebook tonight, and you will write the letter tomorrow. She said, that seems like the right division of labor. He said, yes. He said, it does. Patricia said, Walter. He looked at her. She said, next December. He said, yes. She said, I'll be at the library event in April. He said, I will see you there. She said, I know. She said, you will call my name, and I will not be ready for it, even though I know it is coming because that is what the event does. He said, yes. He said, "That is what the event does." She said, "How does it do that?" He said, "I keep a list." He said, "It is the most important part." He drove home with Geneva in the passenger seat, which was the one variation in the Saturday routine. They drove separately to the parade because Geneva wanted to watch from the crowd, and they drove home together because after the parade, there was no reason to be in separate cars. Geneva talked for most of the drive home, which was 10 minutes, and what she talked about was the crowd. What she had seen from the street, which children had reacted to, which moments who had been new this year, who had cried in the good way, who had cried in the bad way, and been comforted by a parent, and then looked up again and found the sleigh still there. She had spent 14 years watching the parade from the crowd, and she had a specific account of it every year. He listened. She talked. He drove. This was also part of the routine, the debrief, her account of the parade from the side he could not see while he was the parade. The information about the 8 blocks of crowd that he would note in the notebook, because the notebook was not only about the children he would call next year, but about what the parade was for the people watching it, which was the larger purpose, the one that 14 years of names served. He drove home. He hung the suit. He went to the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the notebook, and he added 11 names. He wrote each one carefully in the block printing he had used since the first year, the same printing in the same notebook that had been growing since year 2. He wrote New December Parade, no prior request watch for next library event. He wrote it 11 times with 11 names because next April at the library reading event, he was going to call those 11 names, and when he called them, the children's faces were going to do the thing that Patricia Chen had been thinking about for 7 years, and that he had known the name for since the 2nd year. He closed the notebook. He drank his coffee. Geneva came in from the other room and said, "Are you done?" He said yes. She said, "All 11. He said yes. She said, "Then come watch the news." He said yes. He said, "Give me a minute." He sat for a moment at the kitchen table with the closed notebook in front of him and the cup of coffee and the December evening and the specific quiet of a day that had gone the way it was supposed to go. He put his hand on the notebook. He said nothing. He thought about the 5-year-old in the green coat who had received the nod and whose name he did not yet know. He would not know it until the April library event, if the family came to the library event, or until next December's parade, if they did not. He did not know every child's name. He knew the names he had been given, and he held the ones he did not yet have as future entries placeholders in the notebook for the names that were coming. The green coat child was a future entry. He had given the child the nod instead of the name because the nod was what he had. It had been enough. He had seen the child's face change. It had been enough for now, and the name would come later, and he would write it in the notebook, and next year he would call it from the sleigh, and the child's face would do the thing again, the specific thing that Patricia Chen had been thinking about for 7 years, and it would be the thing again, because it was always the thing year after year when the name was there and was called from the sleigh in the cold and the December morning, and the child's face went from waiting to believing in the half-second between hearing the name and knowing what it meant that he knew it. He went to watch the news with Geneva, who had already found the remote and was on the couch waiting for him. He sat beside her. She did not ask if he was all right. She knew he was all right. She had known he was all right since October when he had said, "I want to understand what is actually happening," and she had known from the way he said it that he was going to understand it and that understanding it was going to be enough. It had been enough. The parade had happened. The notebook had 11 new names. Year 15 was coming. Subscribe our channel. We follow the Santas who keep the real list and who know that the list is the most important part. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.